Encased within the radiation shielding of Station Keth 4, the temperature read 19 degrees Celsius. The walls of compressed regolith composite absorbed sound so completely that Reshven's own footsteps seemed to belong to someone else, someone walking 3 meters behind. The Zyrelian artist had spent 58 years in this chamber, sculpting abstract forms that translated alien emotional frequencies into visual language for the tribunal's records. Never once had the temperature varied by more than half a degree. Never once had the red-shifted lighting from Keth Prime flickered. The station's tidal lock kept one face eternally toward the dwarf star, and the station kept its inhabitants eternally in the same processed air, the same metallic flatness, the same silence that was not quite silence but rather the absence of anything worth hearing. The vote had concluded 7 minutes ago. 73-0. Authorization for the destruction of an unauthorized colony vessel. 2,847 civilians aboard. Reshven's chromatophores shifted involuntarily, a ripple of silver across the dorsal membrane that would have signaled distress to another Zyrelian. Here, in this chamber of dense bone plating and low-frequency vocalization, the gesture went unnoticed. That was the purpose of regolith walls. They absorbed sound, emotion, consequence. The human woman sat 3 rows forward and to the left. Reshven had observed her during 14 previous sessions. She adjusted her glasses by the temple piece exactly twice during each proceeding. Once when entering testimony. Once when the vote was called. The gesture was precise, mechanical, the kind of movement that suggested practice rather than necessity. Reshven had catalogued it as a stress tell, a biological leak in an otherwise controlled presentation. Today, she had performed the gesture only once. She sat now with her hands flat against the observation bench, fingers spread in a posture that Reshven's cultural database identified as preparation for tactile work. As if she were about to sculpt something herself, or plant something, or build. Her stillness had a quality Reshven had never observed in a human before. Not resignation. Not defeat. The quality of water before it boils. High Counselor more than Vec rose from the central dais. The Dorvathy moved with deliberate slowness, each step calculated to demonstrate gravitational authority. His bone plating, dense as neutron star crust, reflected the red-shifted light in patterns that Reshven had once found aesthetically compelling. Now the patterns seemed merely old. 267 years old, to be precise. Vec had attended this chamber for 89 of those years, and in that time, no observer could recall him pausing mid-stride. He did not pause now. He moved toward the human woman with the same unbroken rhythm, stopping precisely at the minimum distance required by protocol for interspecies address. Dr. Nadia Okonkwo, he said. The low-frequency resonance settled in Reshven's chest cavity like sediment. Your vessel was registered. Your registry was invalid. The tribunal has acted within established precedent. Nadia looked up. Her glasses caught the red light and held it, 2 small mirrors showing Vec nothing of her eyes. I understand the precedent, she said. Her voice carried the flatness of the processed air, stripped of the frequencies that would have conveyed emotional data to Reshven's auditory membranes. I question the mathematics. Vec's vocalization dropped another octave, approaching the threshold of physical discomfort. Mathematics? 2,847 civilians, Nadia said. Divided by 0 surviving witnesses. Multiplied by 73 votes. She paused. Her right hand rose to her temple piece, touched it with precisely controlled pressure, returned to the bench. The product is undefined. But you knew that when you built the equation. Reshven's chromatophores shifted again, this time to a pattern of amber curiosity. The human was not pleading. She was not threatening. She was speaking in a register that Reshven's translation software struggled to categorize, the syntax of someone who had already accepted the worst possible outcome and was now observing its aftermath with professional interest. Vex's bone plating clicked, a sound like tectonic plates settling. Your vessel violated established boundaries. Humanity was warned that expansion requires managed parameters. Managed boundaries, Nadia repeated. She opened the notebook on her lap. The pages were paper, a medium Reshven recognized from historical archives but rarely encountered in functional use. Digital systems were more efficient, more secure, more easily audited by tribunal oversight. Paper was vulnerable to decay, to loss, to the physical entropy that the station's systems were designed to eliminate. Nadia turned a page with controlled pressure, the soft sound absorbed immediately by the regolith walls. I have a question about management, Counselor. When you destroy a colony ship, do you account for the oxygen recyclers? The closed-loop systems? The biomass reserves that took 11 years to cultivate? These details are irrelevant to tribunal jurisdiction. They're irrelevant to Dorvathy cognition, Nadia said. I understand. Your species processes threat assessment through spatial dominance. You see a ship in unauthorized space, you remove the ship. The space returns to neutral. The equation balances. She turned another page. The edges were softened by handling, the corners rounded by years of contact. But humans don't balance equations, Counselor. We solve for variables you haven't identified yet. Vex's vocalization dropped to subsonic, felt rather than heard. You have 48 hours to evacuate tribunal space. After that, your presence will be classified as additional unauthorized expansion. He turned. His stride resumed its unbroken rhythm, carrying him toward the chamber's exit. The other council members rose in sequence, their various locomotion patterns creating a brief cacophony of biological and mechanical sounds that the regolith swallowed within seconds. Soon only Reshven and the human remained. Nadia did not move. She sat with her notebook open to a page covered in hand-drawn diagrams, geometric shapes that Reshven's visual processing identified as architectural schematics. Colony vessel layouts. Life support integration. The kind of technical documentation that should have existed only in secured digital archives, subject to tribunal oversight and deletion protocols. Reshven approached. The gesture violated observer protocol, but 58 years of tenure had earned certain privileges, or at least certain invisibilities. You are not grieving, Reshven said. The statement emerged as observation, not question. Nadia looked up. Her eyes, visible now without the reflective barrier of her glasses, contained a quality Reshven had no chromatophore pattern to express. The look of someone who had already completed their mourning in private, who had worn the appropriate emotional performance for witnesses, and who was now returning to work. I completed my grieving 11 years ago, she said. When we founded the Redundant Path program. When I sketched these designs and understood that the tribunal would eventually require a demonstration. She closed the notebook. The softened edges of the pages caught the red light like worn fabric. Grief is efficient when you distribute it across sufficient time. You simply live in it long enough that it becomes indistinguishable from atmosphere. Reshven's dorsal membrane rippled through 3 color phases before settling on sustained amber. I have observed this tribunal for 58 years. You are the first human to speak of variables unidentified. That's because the others were still hoping the variables wouldn't be necessary. Nadia stood. Her movements carried the efficiency of someone accustomed to low gravity, someone who had learned to compensate for 0.42 g through precise muscle control rather than mechanical assistance. I'm a scientist, Reshven, deep space architecture. I don't hope. I calculate. You know my designation. I know everyone's designation in this chamber. Nadia tucked the notebook into her satchel. The gesture was casual, almost careless, as if she were storing a grocery list rather than evidence of 11 years of unsanctioned preparation. You've been translating emotional frequencies into visual language for 5 decades. You've watched species after species enter this room with expansion permits and exit with destruction authorizations. You've never filed a formal objection. Reshven's chromatophores flickered toward defensive crimson, then stabilized. Formal objections are recorded. Recorded objections are remembered. Remembered objections become precedent. And precedent becomes constraint. Nadia adjusted her satchel strap. The movement was economical, the gesture of someone who had learned to carry weight efficiently. I understand. The Xyrelian species survived the tribunal's formation by becoming essential but invisible. You document what happens here. You don't intervene. You certainly don't warn. The accusation, if it was one, landed without inflection. Nadia spoke as she might describe atmospheric composition, factual, measurable, devoid of the moral frequency that Reshven's translation software expected in such statements. I have never warned, Reshven agreed. Then don't start now. Nadia moved toward the exit, her stride adapted to the station's rotation, each step landing with the slight forward drift that 0.42 g imposed on human locomotion. Simply observe. Document what you see. That's what you're good at, isn't it? Finding patterns in distress signals. She paused at the doorway. The red-shifted light from Keth Prime caught her profile, transforming her into a silhouette against the radiation shielding's faint glow. One more variable for your calculations, she said. The Dorvathi believe in managed destruction. Controlled demonstrations of resolve without escalation. They've been doing it for centuries. They think it works because most species, when faced with the destruction of their expansion efforts, choose to contract. To apologize. To wait for permission. She turned. Her glasses had slid slightly down her nose, and she did not adjust them. Humans don't wait well, Reshven, we build when we're told to wait. We plant when we're told the soil is wrong. We calculate when we're told the math is settled. She exited. The regolith walls absorbed the sound of her departure, leaving Reshven alone in the chamber with the faint hum of life support systems and the persistent, subsonic vibration of Keth Prime's infrared radiation against the station's shielding. The artist remained motionless for 47 seconds. Then, with a gesture that violated 58 years of protocol, Reshven activated the chamber's secondary recording system. The one that documented not official proceedings, but emotional frequencies. The one that was supposed to translate distress into abstract form for archival purposes, never for active analysis. Reshven had observed distress in this chamber before. 73 species had entered with expansion permits and exited with destruction authorizations. Each had generated recognizable patterns, the sharp frequencies of shock, the decaying waveforms of grief, the hollow resonance of defeated hope. Nadia Okonkwo had generated none of these. Her emotional frequency, captured by Reshven's peripheral sensors during the exchange, had registered as something the Xyrelian database had no category for. Not distress. Not resignation. The pattern suggested completion. The frequency of a project reaching its final stage. The emotional signature of someone who had been waiting for a specific obstacle to appear, and who was now relieved that it had finally arrived. Reshven's chromatophores shifted to a color that had no name in Xyrelian, a pattern that had not been used in documented history. The closest approximation, found in ancient ceremonial texts, translated roughly as the moment before understanding transforms into obligation. The artist began to sculpt. 3 hours later, Reshven encountered the human again in the regolith corridors connecting the tribunal chamber to the station's residential sectors. The corridors were narrow, designed for Dorvathi dimensions rather than human comfort, and Nadia walked with her shoulders slightly compressed, her body adapted to spaces that had not been built for her species. She was not alone. A younger human walked beside her, processing data on a handheld device with the rapid finger movements that indicated native digital literacy. This second human was perhaps 28 years old, with the efficient movements of someone who had grown up in artificial gravity rather than adapted to it. Dr. Okonkwo, the younger human said, her accent carrying the flattened vowels of Earth's Australian continent, the registry anomalies are appearing in Sector 7 now. The Dorvathy Oversight Team is requesting clarification on vessel classification codes. Tell them we're preparing a formal response, Nadia said. I did. They asked why the codes don't match the construction manifests. Because the construction manifests were filed under different project names. Nadia's pace did not change. Tell them we're cross-referencing. Tell them human administrative systems require manual verification. Tell them anything that buys us 6 hours. The younger human's fingers paused over her device. 6 hours for what? Nadia's hand rose to her temple piece. The gesture was different this time. Slower. The pressure of someone accessing memory rather than suppressing emotion. For the numbers to stop making sense, she said. Unless you've been building for a decade. Reshven had positioned at the corridor's intersection, apparently studying the texture of the regolith wall. The artist's presence was sufficiently familiar that neither human acknowledged it, continuing their conversation with the privacy assumption that Reshven's observer status supposedly guaranteed. Dr. Okonkwo, the younger human said, her voice dropping to the frequency of confidential communication, the numbers don't make sense. Unless you've been building for a decade. The repetition was precise, almost ritualistic. Reshven's auditory membranes detected the subtle emphasis on unless, the way the younger human's breathing pattern shifted after the word decade. This was not improvisation. This was passphrase verification. Nadia stopped walking. She turned to face the younger human fully, and for the first time, Reshven observed the complete absence of performance in her expression. The controlled neutrality of the tribunal chamber had been a mask. This was the face beneath it, focused, exhausted, and carrying a specific weight that had nothing to do with the day's vote. Gemma, Nadia said, when you were training in Perth, did they teach you about red dwarf stellar characteristics? The question was so apparently non sequitur that Gemma's device-handling rhythm stuttered. The coursework covered habitable zone calculations. Tidal locking implications. Why? Because Keth Prime has been stable for 10 billion years, Nadia said. It will continue burning for another 100 billion. The station's radiation shielding is rated for 5 centuries. The Dorvathy have occupied this system for 3,000 years, and they consider that long-term planning. She resumed walking, her stride carrying the slight forward drift that Gemma had not yet mastered. Humans have been building the redundant path for 11 years. We selected red dwarf systems specifically because the Dorvathy wouldn't look for rapid development there. They associate these stars with patience. With slow growth. With projects that take generations. Gemma followed, her device forgotten in her hand. The replacement vessels were completed 8 months ago. Nadia turned a corner, entering a narrower corridor that led toward the station's hydroponic sectors. 3 of them. At 14 unregistered sites. Each with closed-loop life support systems capable of sustaining the populations from the original vessel, plus 40% capacity for additional colonists. Reshven followed at the maximum distance that permitted auditory observation. The regolith walls absorbed most of the sound, but Xyrelian auditory membranes were evolved for precisely this kind of environmental filtering, for detecting emotional frequencies through interference. Why didn't you tell me? Gemma asked. Because you needed to believe the numbers didn't make sense. Nadia stopped before a viewport. Beyond the radiation shielding, Keth Prime hung in eternal noon, a red disk that provided insufficient visible light for human comfort but sufficient infrared for station heating. You needed to process the data as if it were an anomaly. Because when the tribunal discovers that their managed destruction destroyed nothing of consequence, they'll look for who knew. And your confusion needs to be documented. Your frustration with administrative delays. Your entirely reasonable requests for clarification that were met with bureaucratic obstruction. She turned from the viewport. Her face was illuminated from below by the emergency lighting strip, creating shadows that made her appear older than her 39 years. The redundant path has 3 operatives on this station, she said. Declan handles systems integration. He's been here 7 years, building cover as a maintenance technician who does crosswords during night shifts. Cassandra is embedded among the Dorvathy Diplomatic Corps, studying their historical patterns of managed destruction. She's been there 6 years, and she discovered that this isn't the first species they've done this to. There's a pattern. A methodology. They destroy just enough to demonstrate resolve without provoking total war. Gemma's breathing had shifted to the pattern Reshven associated with oxygen deprivation, though the corridor's atmosphere was well within human tolerance. And the third operative? Nadia's hand rose to her temple piece. The gesture was incomplete this time, her fingers stopping millimeters from the frame, as if she had forgotten why she had started it. Ines was detained 5 years ago, she said. She never broke. Never revealed the network, the sites, the timelines. She's in a Dorvathy holding facility in the Malaga system. They allow her 1 message per year. Last year, she wrote about her mother's paella recipe. The specific proportions of rice to seafood stock. The importance of sauerkraut. Gemma's device had gone dark in her hand. She's still alive. She's still human. Nadia's voice carried the flatness that Reshven had observed in the tribunal chamber, but beneath it, the frequency analysis revealed something else. The harmonic of sustained pressure. The waveform of someone who had been holding a specific posture for so long that release had become unthinkable. That's the variable the Dorvathy don't calculate, Gemma. They think in terms of destruction and compliance. They don't understand that humans can carry grief as infrastructure. That we can build systems so robust that the loss of any individual component doesn't compromise the whole. She turned back to the viewport. Keth Prime's red disk filled the frame, eternal and indifferent. They destroyed a ship today, she said. They believe they have demonstrated resolve. They believe they have managed our expansion. They don't know that we invented the game they're playing, 11 years ago, when we realized that their managed destruction was predictable. That it could be routed around. That redundancy itself could become strategy. Reshven's chromatophores had shifted to sustained amber, the pattern of active analysis. The artist understood now why Nadia's emotional frequency had registered as completion rather than defeat. The destroyed vessel was not loss. It was bait. The tribunal had taken precisely the action that the redundant path had been designed to exploit. The formal response, Gemma said slowly. To the Dorvathy oversight team. About the registry anomalies. Will be filed in 6 hours, Nadia said. By which time the backup colony manifests will be activated. The 3 replacement vessels will register simultaneously. The tribunal will be faced with a choice, acknowledge that their managed destruction failed, or escalate to total war against a species that has just demonstrated the capacity to absorb their demonstration and continue expanding. She turned from the viewport. Her glasses caught the red light, and for a moment, Reshven saw the reflection of Keth Prime in each lens, 2 small red discs that mirrored the star beyond. Either choice destroys their model, Nadia said. Acknowledgement makes them appear weak. Escalation makes them appear threatened. The managed boundary system only works if the managed species accepts the boundary. We don't accept. We never stop building. Even when they tell us to wait. She walked past Reshven without acknowledgement, her shoulder passing within arm's reach of the Zyrelian sensory membrane. The proximity allowed Reshven to capture her complete emotional frequency, not the triumph that the Dorvathy would have expected, not the grief that the situation warranted, but something more complex. The harmonic of someone who had been proven correct about a prediction they had desperately hoped would fail. Gemma followed, her stride unsteady in the low gravity, her device still dark in her hand. As she passed Reshven, she paused. Her eyes, younger and less controlled than Nadia's, contained a question that her voice did not ask. Reshven's chromatophores shifted to the pattern that translated, in the artist's limited human vocabulary, as *I document. I do not intervene, *. Gemma nodded, once, as if she had received the answer she expected. Then she followed Nadia into the corridor's red-shifted shadows. Reshven remained at the viewport. Kethprime continued its eternal burn, 10 billion years of stability, another 100 billion to come. The star did not care about tribunal votes or redundant paths or the specific proportions of rice to seafood stock required for proper Sakharat. But the artist cared. For the first time in 58 years of observation, Reshven cared about the specific outcome of a tribunal proceeding. Not as abstract pattern, not as emotional frequency to be translated into sculptural form, but as a sequence of events that would determine whether a species that built in paper and grief and 11 years of patient preparation would be permitted to continue existing. The Zyrelian began walking toward the residential sectors, moving against the flow of station traffic, heading toward the sculptural installation that occupied the central atrium. The work was 58 years in progress, an abstract representation of all distress signals observed in this chamber. It had never included human patterns. The human emotional range had been too chaotic, too contradictory, too difficult to translate into Zyrelian aesthetic syntax. That would change tonight. Reshven would add a new form to the installation. A structure that captured the frequency of Nadia Okonkwo's emotional signature, the completion that was not triumph, the grief that was infrastructure, the specific weight of carrying a dead woman's paella recipe as operational security. The artist did not know if this act constituted warning. Did not know if it constituted intervention. Only knew that for the first time in 58 years, observation had become insufficient. The red disk of Kethprime watched through the viewport, indifferent to whether Reshven's addition to the installation would be recognized as signal or noise. Whether the Dorvathy would pause in their unbroken stride to consider what patterns might be emerging in the species they had attempted to manage. The temperature remained 19 degrees Celsius. The walls continued absorbing sound. The processed air maintained its metallic flatness. But something had shifted. Reshven could feel it in the subsonic frequencies that the regolith could not fully contain, in the vibration of a station that had never before held humans who built for red dwarf time scales while moving at human speed. The numbers didn't make sense. Unless you had been building for a decade. 6 hours later, the registry anomalies reached critical density. Reshven observed from the atrium's upper gallery as the tribunal chamber emptied for the emergency session. Dorvathy council members moved with their characteristic unbroken rhythm, but Reshven's chromatophores detected the frequency of disrupted pattern in their low-frequency vocalizations. The low hum that usually accompanied their deliberations had shifted to something sharper, more arrhythmic. A low hum. Then the registry anomalies began appearing. The artist descended to the installation floor. The new form, added in the hours since the corridor encounter, stood at the center of the atrium, an abstract representation of Nadia Okonkwo's emotional signature, rendered in compressed regolith composite that matched the station's walls. Reshven had shaped it to capture the specific frequency of completion not triumph, the waveform of infrastructure grief. To human eyes, it might resemble a vessel of some kind. To Dorvathy perception, it would register as threat pattern, something that demanded management. To Reshven, it was simply true. The installation's automatic recording system, typically used to document visitor responses for aesthetic analysis, captured the emergency session's audio feed. Reshven listened as the Dorvathy oversight team presented their findings. 3 vessels. 14 unregistered sites. Closed-loop life support systems with biomass reserve sufficient for the original colony population plus 40% expansion capacity. These registrations are invalid. High Counselor Vek's voice resonated through the atrium's sound system, subsonic frequencies vibrating in Reshven's chest cavity. The vessels were constructed without tribunal authorization. A different voice responded. Younger. Australian continent inflection. The construction permits were filed under Project Redundant Path, Counselor. 11 years ago. Before your managed destruction policy was formally adopted. Project Redundant Path was never approved for vessel construction. It was never rejected, either. Gemma's voice carried the specific flatness of someone reading from prepared documentation. It remained in administrative review for 11 years. Human administrative systems require manual verification. You are familiar with our bureaucratic delays. Reshven's chromatophores shifted to amber analysis. The phrase was identical to Nadia's instruction in the corridor. Passphrase verification, elevated to institutional protocol. The emergency session continued for 47 minutes. Reshven documented the frequency shifts in Vek's vocalization, the unprecedented harmonic of uncertainty that entered his subsonic range when Gemma presented the construction manifests. The manifests were paper, Reshven realized. Analog documentation, immune to digital deletion, carrying the softened edges of 11 years of handling. Vek's bone plating clicked. The sound, usually tectonic and settling, now carried the frequency of structural stress. The original vessel, he said. The one we authorized for destruction. It was bait. It was a demonstration, Gemma corrected. You wanted to show resolve without escalation. We wanted to show that your resolve has no purchase on our infrastructure. A pause. Reshven's auditory membranes detected the subtle shift in her breathing, the same pattern observed in Nadia, the oxygen efficiency of someone who had been holding a specific posture for years. The choice is yours now, Counselor. Acknowledge that your managed destruction failed, or escalate to total war against a species that has just demonstrated the capacity to build faster than you can destroy. The chamber held its silence. Not the regolith-absorbed quiet of normal proceedings, but the dense silence of a species confronting the limits of its own model. Vek did not pause mid-stride. He had never paused mid-stride in 89 years of attendance. But his vocalization dropped to a frequency that Reshven's translation software struggled to categorize, a subsonic range that suggested the Dorvathy equivalent of the color pattern Reshven had used for the new installation, the moment before understanding transforms into obligation. Recess, Vek said. 12 hours. The chamber emptied. Reshven remained with the installation, observing the red-shifted light from Keth Prime as it passed through the abstract form's contours. The light transformed as it passed through, emerging on the other side with a quality that Reshven's chromatophores registered as recognition. The frequency of someone seeing their own reflection in an unexpected surface. 12 hours later, the vote failed to achieve quorum. 4 council members had filed formal objections. 5 neutral governments had requested observation status for the emergency session. The managed destruction policy, applied so consistently for 3,000 years, had encountered a variable that disrupted its mathematics. Reshven encountered Nadia in the corridor again, 3 days after the failed quorum. She was walking toward the hydroponic sectors, her satchel over her shoulder, her stride carrying the slight forward drift that had become familiar. She did not appear surprised to see the Xyrelian. You added something to the installation, she said. Not a question. I documented what I observed. Nadia stopped walking. Her hand rose to her temple piece, completed the gesture with the slow pressure of someone accessing memory rather than suppressing emotion. The Dorvathy military advisor. Vek Thou. He stood before your new form for 31 minutes yesterday. He has never paused mid-stride in 89 years of attendance. Yesterday, he stopped completely. His emotional frequency was unfamiliar to my database, Reshven said. I have no chromatophore pattern for it. Nadia resumed walking. Reshven fell into step beside her, violating observer protocol with the casualness of someone who had already crossed the boundary between observation and participation. He was realizing that humans are dangerous, she said. Not because we can destroy. Because we can build. Because we built for 11 years without permission, without detection, without the need for acknowledgement. Because we carried grief as infrastructure and turned it into redundancy. She turned a corner, entering the hydroponics sector. The air here carried a different quality, moisture and organic compounds that the station scrubbers struggled to fully process. The Dorvathy have been managing species for millennia. They've never encountered one that treats destruction as routing information. As data about which paths to activate. They reached a small viewport chamber. Nadia's herbs grew in a hydroponic window garden, green leaves absorbing the red-shifted light that passed through the radiation shielding. She touched a leaf with the same controlled pressure she used for her notebook pages, the gesture of someone who had learned to handle living things without damage. Ines is still in Malaga, she said. The Sovereign Pact negotiations will include her release. Equal seating, rotating leadership, no veto powers. The preamble lists 12 names. She's one of them. Reshven's chromatophores shifted to the pattern that translated as acknowledgement without comprehension. She wrote about paella. She wrote about proportions. Nadia's hand moved from the herbs to her satchel, extracting the paper notebook. The edges were softened by handling, the corners rounded by years of contact. She opened it to a page that Reshven recognized, the geometric schematics from the tribunal chamber, colony vessel layouts, life support integration. But she turned past these, to a page near the back where the paper was less worn, the edges still relatively sharp. These are the original sketches, she said. From 11 years ago. When we founded the redundant path. When I realized that the tribunal's managed destruction was predictable enough to route around. She turned another page. The schematic showed a different vessel design, smaller, more efficient, optimized for the specific radiation profile of red dwarf systems. And these are the current designs. What we're building now that we don't have to hide. Reshven observed the 2 pages side by side. The original sketches were rough, urgent, the lines of someone working against time they couldn't fully predict. The current designs were precise, methodical, the work of someone who had proven their model and was now refining it. The paper, Reshven said. It is inefficient. Vulnerable to decay. To loss. To digital erasure, Nadia agreed. She closed the notebook. The softened edges of the early pages caught the red light, while the sharper edges of the recent designs remained in shadow. The Dorvathy oversight systems can't read paper. Can't delete it. Can't modify it without physical access. We built our redundancy in a medium they don't recognize as functional. She returned the notebook to her satchel. The gesture was different now, Reshven observed. Not casual, not careless. The gesture of someone who understood that the object had become evidence of something larger than personal preparation. Reshven, she said. When you documented my emotional frequency in the tribunal chamber. The completion rather than defeat. How did you represent it? Reshven's chromatophores shifted through 3 phases before settling on the pattern that translated as truth requires translation, translation requires loss. As structure, the artist said. As something built to sustain weight. I used regolith composite, the same material as the walls. The same material the Dorvathy chose to absorb sound and consequence. A pause. The subsonic vibration of Keth Prime's infrared radiation against the station's shielding filled the space between them. I did not understand what I was building until I built it. That is the nature of observation, I think. You document patterns until the patterns reveal you to yourself. Nadia adjusted her glasses by the temple piece. The gesture, performed for the second time in Reshven's observation, carried a different frequency now. Not suppression, not memory access, but something closer to acknowledgement. The 38 seconds of permitted emotion, distributed across 11 years of preparation, finally arriving at its destination. Gemma is presenting navigation data to the Sovereign Pact Commission tomorrow, she said. Young species, old species, all the ones who were told to wait for permission. She's showing them the red dwarf sites. The closed-loop systems. The specific proportions of rice to seafood stock required for proper Soccerat, transmitted through 5 years of detention without breaking. She turned to the viewport. Keth Prime hung beyond the radiation shielding, eternal and indifferent. A young Kathari engineer asked me yesterday how humans rebuilt so quickly, she said. I told him we never stopped building. Even when they told us to wait. Her reflection in the viewport glass superimposed itself over the red disk, a human silhouette against stellar permanence. He didn't understand. He thinks we were planning for this specific conflict. He doesn't understand that we build because we cannot stop. That the building is not strategy. It is simply what we are. Reshven's chromatophores shifted to the unnamed color, the pattern from ancient ceremonial texts. The moment before understanding transforms into obligation. I will add to the installation, the artist said. The frequency of that explanation. The specific weight of being misunderstood in a way that reveals truth. Nadia nodded. She did not turn from the viewport. Document what you see, Reshven, that's what you're good at. She remained at the viewport as the Zarelian departed, her silhouette absorbing the red-shifted light, her herbs growing in their hydroponic garden, her notebook carrying the softened edges of 11 years of preparation and the sharper edges of what came next. The temperature remained 19 degrees Celsius. The walls continued absorbing sound. The processed air maintained its metallic flatness. But the stars were still there. They felt different now. Not closer exactly. Just more like something that belonged to everyone.